is going to bite back. And we actually predicted it. So the drought that we're seeing today, the lack of rain, is not even as much as it has been in the past. But the impact has been catastrophic because what we're seeing is ecosystems collapsing. The moment you see species disappearing from an ecosystem, the resilience of that ecosystem starts to crumble. It's like a domino effect. You take out some species and then things start to knock onto each other. I did a story. I went down to Amboseli with National Geographic because I was surprised to see so few of my colleagues in conservation were telling this story. And when I inquired, they told me in a very hushed voice, elephants are dying. Hundreds of elephants are dying. And I had to go down for myself to see. We went in with cameras, video cameras, drones, and we documented what's happening and we put out the pictures. And I made all the pictures and videos available to any conservationist who wanted to tell the story of the drought in order to transform our response. We need to rehabilitate these landscapes. We cannot just think a little bit of rain, a shower, is going to solve the problem. It's not. We need to rehabilitate the landscape.
Yes, and we'll talk about those interventions in greater detail a little later on in our conversation.
But if I could just say, Joe, what I want to say is that very few people were willing to use the photographs, which were very shocking. Why? Because we have cowed our people into a state of fear. When you complain or raise an alarm about something, you can get into a lot of trouble.
What trouble?
Look, Wangari Maathai almost got killed for trying to save this forest. Environmental defenders are being attacked, intimidated, even killed in this country and across the continent and around the world. We know that because environment has often been seen as in the way of development. Nobody has mentioned it so far. But this is a real threat, and I'm really thrilled to hear the government of Kenya today talking about this new initiative, this new energy, this new persona of Kenya is green. This relationship with nature is something that could transform our relationship and actually rehabilitate and restore everything. But we need to remove that fear from our colleagues. We need to be courageous, as somebody said in the previous panel. We need to be courageous enough to tell the real stories and not fear that we're going to get a bullet in our head.
All right. Wow. So Karimot, let's come to you. What's your story? What direction do you come from when you talk about climate change?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be on this panel. I came from Nigeria. I live in a city in Nigeria. It's called Ibadan. I come from Nigeria. And then I would want to tell you something.
Is that where Chinua Achebe went to school?
Oh, yes, he did. In November 2022, it was recorded that 33 states out of 36 states in Nigeria was overflooded. So that's 33 out of 36. That's about 95% of the state in Nigeria was overflooded. And when this happened just last month, it made me remember something that happened back in 2006. I could remember in 2006, I was a very young girl, and then I went to the hairdresser to plait my hair. I was going to school the next day, and I could hear stories like, that there is this particular river, it's called Oduono. This river is overflooded. There were a lot of people that were killed. Cars that were trying to cross the bridge, went down the river. And then there were so many stories, how many people lost their lives and their property. It was all over the media and all of that. And that was my first experience to climate change. That was 2006. But I could tell you, this singular incident did not make people to stop throwing dirt into the river, and doing things that would affect the climate. So my story, as a poet, I write, I perform, I use my heart. I always see that narrations are very important. And then the human how human beings are, we like the art part of science. Yes, science can look complicated, but as humans, let me just say as Africans, we are all Africans, and one thing that we have as Africans is the folklores. I mean, we have the stories, we can remember days we sit under the trees and we listen to stories about the days of our fathers, and all of those folklores. So those are ways that our grandfathers, they were able to put in the morals into us. So I thought about how can I contribute to the sustainable development goals. I want to use my heart. So one thing I do is I write poetry as regards the heart, and I say it. And then that's one thing I think we should imbibe. Narrations are very important. Narratives are very important. And the media, they are the fourth arm of the government, but they are very much important. When we keep on talking about the effect of this of climate change and how it's going to benefit the larger populace, it's going to do us a bit. And I think that one of the problems we keep on making is that we look at the bigger story. I think that we have to come down to the smaller story. What is happening in the world today, the global, what everybody's raving about, climate change, here and that and here and that. Africa, we are the least contributor to the green gas emission, but we are the one that is going to bear the brunt of this, and it's already started. But now we have to have to shift our focus as Africans. Let's go out of all of this rave that the world is raving about. I mean, it looks like they care, but I could tell you that they really do not care. So what can we do as Africans ourselves? And I'm coming from the perspective of a young person. We have to take, actions in our hands. And it could come with us, the narration that we guide. What are we doing in our homes? I like to say this, that the family is the smallest unit in the society, but it is the most powerful unit. When we are on the dining tables with our children, are we talking about the climate change? Are we talking about the behavioral change that we should imbibe? Are we telling them that the use of we should reduce the use of plastic? Are we telling them that dropping things on the road and not properly disposing them, the effect that is going to be? I mean, it might be one action. It's a simple action, but what is the larger effect of this? So yes, we have to move away from the bigger story and how the developed world are trying to make this like I would say this is a glass, and they are trying to make it like a sweet. When you put a very shiny thing inside this glass cup and you give it to a baby, they get so excited. They are making it like that. So yes, we have to now start breaking down this story that climate change is not something that is far. It is something that is here, and we need to start taking it a step at a time.
Thank you. And one person who's been doing that for years is Otula Award, but I'll hold him for a minute and speak to Dr. Clark. And Dr. Clark, if you can hear us, I was just going through one of your journal articles. I think that one came out just this year about the impacts of climate change on African heritage. And it intrigued me because people don't often talk about archaeology and heritage when they're talking about climate change. Just give it a little bit of a sense of how important this connection is between climate change and heritage, and just what you found out, because you seem to have done quite a bit of research in this area.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I feel honored to be here and with this panel of experts. So I am an archaeologist, and I've worked mostly in North Africa for the last nearly 20 years as an archaeologist and as a specialist in heritage. And I was invited. I was an author on the Africa chapter of the the most recent IPCC Working Group 2, Adaptation, Vulnerability and Risk, for a specific heritage section. And this was really exciting because the Africa chapter of the IPCC report is the only chapter that has a dedicated heritage section. None of the other chapters have any. There's reference to heritage and to local and to indigenous knowledge, but not a specific section. So Africa is leading the field in this. And the importance of this, and I will get to the paper that we wrote in a minute, but the importance of this is I don't think people recognize that heritage literally underpins everything that we do and that we are. So if you look at the sectors, the sectoral chapters within the IPCC report, so if you look at ocean systems or freshwater systems, terrestrial systems, heritage is part of all of that. Ocean systems, you can talk about shipwrecks, you can talk about coral reefs. Terrestrial systems, you can talk about ancient life waves, African pastoralism. Freshwater systems, you can talk about, say, for example, the Saloum Delta in Senegal and all of the shell middens and the burial grounds that have existed there for, thousands of years. So under all of our lives and the way we live, heritage underpins all of it. And the really important thing is that we as individuals and small communities are responsible for it. And I think for climate change, heritage is incredibly important, because at the local level, at the level of our traditions and our ways of life, the things that matter to us, heritage is the underpinning of all of that. So we literally begin it at the grassroots, and it's having a grassroots responsibility that will enable us, I think, to change our environments. And I think heritage is completely linked with that. In terms of the, do you want to hear about the paper, or shall I stop there?
No, I think you kind of covered a little bit of it, because I read it, and I think it touched on a lot of what you're talking about. But what intrigues me, which is what I want to follow up on here, is a lot of people don't look at all those things you mentioned as heritage. I mean, in the minds of many people, and we're talking about storytelling here, narratives that we deal with every day. I mean, in the minds of many people, heritage is things like, archaeological finds, old buildings, and also all sorts of monuments. Tell us how important it is to look at things like, oceans and all of these living parts of our universe as actually part of our heritage, and how helpful is that in telling the climate change story in a way to drive it home?
Sure. So I think this is one of the things we want to, me and people who work on African heritage, and there's lots of us, and there's lots of people in Kenya as well. I think what we want to get across is that heritage isn't just archaeological sites or buildings or important parts of cities. It's literally it's everything. It's the way we think about our worlds, it's our worldviews, so of course in Kenya it might be sacred forests, but it's also about the integration of what we would think as natural areas or regions, forests and coral reefs, which we've just heard about. I mean, these are our heritage, and they're not just. It's not just natural. They're culturalized spaces. These forests are culturalized. We live in them. We think about them. As soon as we think about them, we are placing our traditions on them. And that's the same with coral reefs and mangrove forests, deltas. So it's about linking all of the world we live in that we have culturalized. I think that's the important point to make, and this is how this feeds into the narrative of climate change, is that we culturalize our world, and in that process we create heritage that we as individuals and communities are responsible for. We are the custodians of our culturalized places that we live in. And I think if we could get that message across in the narratives, I think we would find that we would be able to protect our environments more, because I don't think people think about the places that they live in as you know, their traditions, their heritage, that it belongs to them. It's enabling people at the most basic level to realize that it belongs to them, and it is their heritage to pass on.
All right, thank you very much, and we'll get back to you in a short while. But let me come back to Otula here. I mean, we've been doing this for many years. I know you've done it a lot longer than I have, but there is a sense in which when you hear things like archaeology connected to climate change, when you hear things like poetry and that sort of thing, even wildlife, by the way, for a long time, those are not the sort of stories that we really told, at least not in that connection. I mean, there was a lot of doom and gloom, as we called it back then, around issues of the environment generally, and climate change, even if it's a more recent story in the bigger scheme of things. What goes through your mind when you look at this transformation that has happened in the story of climate change, and how would you characterize it?
Thank you very much. I think things have changed a lot within the last 1 year. This used to be my
I don't know if, is your microphone on? Can you hear him? Oh, great. Yeah, we are good now.
Yeah, things have changed because for a long time, as I was still a young reporter, coming to UN headquarters where there were these discussions on pending climate change, global warming. It was like them versus us. It was like the third world with no technology, with the incapable of industrialization, attacking the holy Christian civilization. It was all sorts of exchanges here at UNEP headquarters. So for me, it was a major achievement what happened in Egypt last time, when literally every country came there a bit beaten up, because what used to be said as a myth has turned out to be true. Right now, I think the major driving force, which will help even the climate finance, the way you call it, is what has happened in the developed nations. You take China, they have seen their biggest river dry up. You take US, Mississippi drying up. You take Germany, River Rhine drying up. These are people who would have come and said, no, you just want a bag of money to go and import things. Now they realize the truth is here, what used to sound like things that were not going to happen. So we are all in the same basket with the West. For the first time, people in Italy can see what drought can do if your crops don't get harvested. So people will have to go back to the drawing board. So this is a very important time in that there is going to be global cooperation. And we in our continent have to put our act together in the sense that we have to go back to the drawing board and see what are our real problems. Is it water? Like we have seen livestock die. And these are in counties which should have made it a priority to have dams and wells. So there is a lot for somebody to talk about or sing about or write about in terms of the situation the world is in now. But just as we have seen drought in these areas, we have seen floods in places like Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, just raise your microphone.
Yes, flood in Pakistan. So there is no more question of what I've been monitoring a lot of journalists who used to write kind of negative things. For the last 2, 3, 4 months, you don't see that. So climate change is a reality.
And we'll talk about the journalism part of it in a short while. But Dr. Kahumbo, let me come back to you here. You are a scientist by every definition of that word, and here you are telling stories. How important is this idea of telling stories about climate change? Because we will then be talking about getting people to act on what they know. And most scientists don't tell stories in a manner that we can understand.
Thank you. You're so right. I did my PhD, and I very quickly became so disillusioned because all these amazing scientific papers and all this incredible research being done in Kenya and across Africa is sitting on dusty shelves or in libraries which are inaccessible to us anyway. And which politician is ever going to read a scientific paper, really? They are very hard to read. It's very complicated stuff. So telling stories is a very powerful way of making sense of important information. It's also a very powerful way to move audiences from inaction to action, because stories they take us on a journey. Stories put us in the stories. Stories make us feel that we have agency. So at Wildlife Direct, what we do is we tell stories where we put Africans at the heart of our stories. For the first time, Africans at the front line of conservation, saving elephants, rhinos, lions, whales, sharks, you name it. When people see these films, they get a bit shocked. And recently, we started a new series. So Wildlife Warriors is the series we do with grown-ups. We started a new series with children, 10-year-olds, telling Africa's wildlife stories from across the country, from across the continent, 5 countries, including Nigeria. We have 11 children presenting Africa's wildlife. And when some of those children came to a village south of Nairobi National Park, and the children were watching the film, and they met the presenters, these young kids from Nairobi, and they were like, "But where are you kids from?" They couldn't believe that here in Kenya, we have children who can actually be presenters for Disney, telling stories about nature. And these stories are moving children to take action. Some of the things we're seeing our children do after watching just one episode of Team Sayari. We see children going out collecting litter, planting trees, building bee hotels. I mean, it's amazing to see the power of stories.
I mean, as a student of environmental governance, one of the things, the criticisms I've had of the conservation movement all around the world, quite frankly, is that it's often presented as a dichotomy between people and wildlife. How do you make that connection so that people don't think that all these people are concerned about this unique butterfly in some forest and they don't care about me? How do you make that connection so that people actually know that they have a stake in conserving nature and to the wider context of climate change that we are talking about here?
It's a very, very good point, because most of the international films, which they call blue chip, the amazing documentaries that you see National Geographic, BBC and others making, usually you don't see a single human being. You'll hear about lions of Masai Mara as if they exist without a single human in their landscape. That's part of the reason why in all of our films we have people in those stories, because those animals live in our histories, they live in our stories, and we cannot do conservation without human beings. So that relationship between people and nature is, for us, it's really vital that we demonstrate it, and we amplify it, and we demonstrate to people, our audiences, how connected we are to nature. I think it's fascinating when you see a light bulb go off for somebody watching a film and they suddenly realize something, or they go outside and they start to look at the butterflies for the first time, or they start to witness how zebras, an animal which the people consider to be so common, but when you've learned something new about zebras, suddenly your relationship with these common animals shifts.
Okay, let's come to you, Cameron. This idea of stories, because there are narratives that have been created around climate change, and I like the idea that you had about small stories. That is not just some big global phenomenon that is happening, but it has a direct connection to me. How in your day-to-day work as a poet and all the other things you are, how do you infuse this into the work you do, these little stories, and what are you telling people?
Okay. So I will start with, I have a published book, and then one of the poems in the book, it's a collection of 107 poems, and one of the poems there talks about Mother Earth, and it says that, you know, this earth is our home. Mother Earth allowed us to be. Why are we not allowing Mother Earth to be? Because literally, this is not ours. We are occupying the earth, and we are still being unkind to the earth. I think that we need to take several steps backward as humans and realize the danger we are putting ourselves into, and also the earth that is occupying us. It's a story of a landlord and a tenant. It's not your house, and then you as the tenant, you are trying or conjuring with all other tenants to kill your landlord. I think that's very unkind. Very unkind. So, connecting that to small stories. When we tell people that kind of stories, that this thing is not some scientific stories like green. I mean, the generations of my mother, when I have a conversation with them about greenhouse gas emission, they don't understand, and they don't want to understand. I mean, talk about the market woman in Lagos, Nigeria. She doesn't understand. But when we come down to tell them that you are in this particular market, and then you keep on throwing your liters. When there is rain, you throw your liters on them, so that the flood can carry it away. It's taking this liters somewhere, and there will be someday that this river is going to turn back at you. And you know what is going to happen? You might lose your life, and you might lose your property. These are small stories. And telling the people the causes of this issue, and also telling them the consequences of their issue. Another ways I would say that I am trying to leave these stories of climate change is that my organization, one thing we do is that we understand the importance of climate education, and then we take this into secondary schools. And one of our plans moving forward is to have clubs in secondary schools. We want to activate clubs in secondary schools where these people, we are not talking over them. They are the one talking to us. They are the one coming together to write poems about climate issues. They are the one writing radio dramas about climate issues, and they are the one educating their peers. So that's one important way of allowing people live their story. And also, when we talk about key messaging, we have to also look at the art that we are throwing out to people, the communications, the messaging. There are things that they can easily relate with. I mean, we have plans also to have this radio drama, and it's going to be here on radio in local languages. When we keep on doing things like that, people are going to realize that this is a problem, and this is the solution, and you are part of the solution. And one other thing I want to say is that as Africans, we are religious people. We like our religion. And yes, when we also tell stories from the angles of religion, it is very important. When we take our messaging and our communication to the mosque and the churches and tell them that when you disobey, when you litter the earth, when you do things that are going to cause climate issue, you are disobeying God. Because when we look at our religious books, there are things connected to it. Because, yeah, so those are ways that we can come from the story telling aspect. Also, we can also come from the angle of human right. When there are climatic issues, it's a human right violation. Because when there is flooding, when there is deforestation and all of that, the human right violation is that people die. People lose their shelter. So yes, let's come from that angle. And also from the women right angle. I'm an gender equality activist. And when we tell people that when you continue doing things like this, you are causing more and more women to danger and to disconvenience. So yes, those are ways that we can find the angles to approach it, and also put people as key actors in this situation.
Thank you very much. Let's get another angle from the UK, and we'll speak to Dr. Clark here. And you are giving us this interesting nexus between climate change, heritage, and we want to get to narratives now. I mean, beyond the academic work that you do, the abstracts, literature review, and all the theoretical frameworks, ultimately there's a story that connects with ordinary people who might need to take action on the ground. What are some of those storylines that you see, the narratives that you think will be compelling enough to basically drive people to a place where they can take action about this global crisis that climate change is?
So you make an excellent point, and I just want to pick up on a point that one of the previous speakers made about the connection between the scientific evidence and telling the story. So this is quite problematic because people are not really interested in the science behind the stories, but in order for us to make a difference, sometimes we have to move beyond the anecdotal, and so the science does need to be integrated into the stories in order that we can make a difference, that we can kind of get the policymakers to take action for us, for the individual communities that are seeing their heritage wash away into the sea, for example. So the paper that we wrote was about quantifying the impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion that is caused by climate change across the whole African coastline. And we wanted to do this because, everyone can see it. Everyone can see what's happening to where they live. My panelist who comes from Nigeria, the West African coast is one of the most impacted, and you can photograph it and record it, but it's not having the impact with policymakers that it needs to have. And so we thought that if we could quantify it and then tell the stories, so that we had hard data underpinning the narratives, that might just start to shift the viewpoints of governments and even just local councils to do something. So we quantified it in the paper, and we know that from the modelling that we did that some regions of the African coastline are going to be terribly impacted in the next, before 2100, in the next 20, 30, 50 years, by coastal erosion and sea level rise. And I mentioned earlier the Saloum Delta. It's one of the most fragile areas of West Africa to these changes. And we hope that by giving these data to the people on the ground, they have something that underpins their stories, that hardens up their stories into more than just anecdotes.
All right, thank you very much, and please don't go away because we haven't finished. But Otula, this is interesting. You talked about how storytelling is changing around climate change. How important is it for that to change from the doom and gloom that characterized this space for a long time to a place where people are being told the kind of stories that move them to act, the kind of stories that empower them to act? And I'll ask you in a short while how that squares with all the things that we have been taught about how to do journalism.
Yes, I think even journalism is evolving. It is no longer the way.
Just raise your mic because
you're
saying a very important thing.
Yeah, journalism is evolving. The way we used to do stories when I started is totally different from now. It used to be very simple. How many people died? Who said finished? Now journalism is going towards solutions. The journalists are better educated, more informed. Some are professionals in other areas, so they can deal with these issues more effectively. But it should be the issue of people impact. People impact. So when you do your stories, people impact. People range from policymakers to the indigenous communities. In this our region, where particularly when you talk of wildlife, the Maasai, they have a rich tradition of preserving wildlife. That has not been captured effectively. There was a time when I think some group of tourists said there was no room for 1 million tourists and 1 million Maasais. I think I was still a bit hot-headed. I say, we don't need a single tourist, we need 1 million Maasais. Because they are from a culture of conservation, preservation, and not like many of us who started to see this as a commercial thing. There's a lot to learn from indigenous communities. With this, what has happened? It is no longer a question of technology going, forces of nature are still powerful when it comes to even the modern world. But as journalists, we need to keep a close watch on what our government policies because influencing policy is very important. And in Africa, to sort our issues, we need homegrown science and technology. And I would have strongly encouraged policymakers, though it may be too late, we badly need a Ministry of Research, Science and Technology to coordinate all these things, because they are linked. You can't have people dealing with water, another part, another with health, and all these things are related. Ministry of Research, Science and Technology, and funding research, science and technology. It is the job of journalists to translate and, make this thing understandable to the public and the people impact. But we can get all the money we are going to get, but if we don't fund our science the way we had promised, Kenya had promised one time 1%, it moved ahead to 2% of the budget. Other African countries have not even reached 1%, even Kenya. So even if we get the money, which some of my friends in the West say...
But Otula, one of the things I've heard people say, people who study how the journalism is evolving, as you say, but there's this question that journalists are taught to be objective, to be balanced. And the question comes on issues like climate change, for example. Is there a place for activism? Can journalists be biased towards the environment, towards climate?
When you are biased, it means you are unreasonable. But if you are using facts, if you are using data, and journalism is evolving, journalists are being trained to use data.
We have both sides of the story, as we are told.
And you have first to be accurate, to be reliable, truth. If you don't have those, you can't be a journalist for long. So the idea of journalists just copying what people say and repeating it and going home is gone. You do research. And there's facilities nowadays. With their phone, they can know what is happening in any part of the world. So we are there to inform and educate. I know professors always wonder, whom do these journalists educate? But there's always room for journalists to get information, package it in such a manner that policymakers or those who are concerned will take a positive action to improve the situation. Kenya is in the right direction, I would say. This regime from where it is starting, there's something positive about the environment. You can pick on that. It means they would be willing to solve some of these problems. There's a lot of expectation on what happened in Egypt. And personally, I'm glad because one of the people who really fought for these climate change issues, Tolba, was an Egyptian. And he was here for over 18 years also. He had already died. But if you bring a bit of superstition, I was impressed that really this thing came, the agreement came in his home ground. So within the continent, far from what people used to think. And it came so suddenly that from now, even us, we are not far from impact of climate change. We have good journalists here. One of them did a very good story on our river Tana starting to be salty, which was an indication that the ocean is probably, and this he picked from the herdsmen who saying, no, this thing is not, So you have to be a good journalist, know your audience, go to the people. People know a lot. And that story won. It was better than CNN, BBC, the American Academy of Science Association. He won. So there is a lot for us to do in this area, particularly journalists. There's a lot of information.
No, Paula, this idea of how journalists tell stories, particularly related to the environment more generally, and even climate change now, are people like yourself frustrated by how journalists tell stories? Is that why you tell the stories yourself? I mean, most people don't expect scientists to be out there following elephants and telling stories about them.
I always start with the audience. Who is the audience that we want to reach, and what do we want them to do? Here in Africa, I would say our public are generally less informed than the public in the global north. And so, I work very hard to make sure that we bring content to our African audiences that they can understand, that they can make sense of. It doesn't mean that I'm frustrated with African journalists. I think African journalists are working in a very difficult environment. I mean, as you said, we don't have many people doing research in these areas. Go to Nairobi National Park. We are a city of 5 million people. How many scientists are studying climate change in Nairobi Park? Not even one. 40 universities in this city. Not one of them is studying climate change in Nairobi National Park. So there is a challenge, and I like what you said, and I think we should actually raise this with the government and seek to unleash our young people to go and do research on these important things. But as an ecologist who is using media to achieve our goal of conservation, I think storytelling is very, very powerful. I do journalistic articles, but I find that storytelling in the form of films and documentaries are compelling. Children have fun when they're watching, they're entertained, and at the same time they're learning. It's a very different way of getting information and knowledge and feeling compelled to take action than just reading it in your science book in school. So I think that we're going to always have multiple different ways of communicating and inspiring people to move to action.
And I want us to start moving to the practical aspects of this. And Karimot, if you could just relate to us some of the ways in which you have told the stories and the impacts that you have seen, because we are saying telling stories can drive action on the ground. So from your world of storytelling, what are some of the moments that you have felt that the stories you have told have actually had an impact, and that probably people took action, or you could tell that they were in a better place now to take action?
Okay, so I would say that we should start from one person. And from my own one person was a 14-year-old SS2 student in Lagos, Nigeria. I met her at a conference in Lagos. I was invited, and it was a debate competition. I was invited as a guest. And then she was very articulate and very vibrant. And then I told the organizers I wanted to give her a copy of my book. We exchanged number, and a few weeks after, she sent me a message that she read the poems, and then 2 particular poems, struck her most. And then, believe me, it was the first one she said was one about the climate, the one I wrote. And the second one was about women, the importance of women in the society. And that was it for me. And one thing she said was, I think I am ready to publish my own book. And that was a lot of story for me. So publishing a book might be, I think that is another step for me to start writing. I think that is another inspiration for me to start writing about the climate. So that is it for me. So that is one way, or that is the closest one of recent time that my work has inspired somebody. And then moving forward, not just my work, the radio dramas have also inspired quite a lot of people. So yes, when we talk about storytelling, you don't have to start quoting the numbers. I mean, the numbers might sound scary. 10 million people and all of that. But are those 10 million people that they really inspire? We should be very passionate, or more, I'm concerned that one person is going to get the message and act on that message.
Wow. Thank you very much. Dr. Clark, let's come to you about this idea of the impact that what we do then has on the ground. I wonder, from where you set the sort of things you would remember that you say, well, we did this, and I think this has been the impact. Have you been able to come across something that you could share this afternoon about your work and how then it relates to the wider society, or whatever small part of it?
Sure, yes. I think a really important point, which hasn't kind of been made explicitly yet, is that climate change is, the impacts of climate change are exacerbated by what we do, by anthropogenic activity. So if you take, for example, the coast of Ghana, the Volta River Delta, someone mentioned, I think in the urban panel, about sand mining. This is a real problem for coastal areas of Africa where sand is mined, and then the impacts on coastal erosion are just cascade from there. It's just exacerbated. So it's sand mining. And then you know, local councils or governments think that then if we've got coastal erosion, then what we should do is groin along the coast. But all that does is erode further down the coast. So the Ghanaian coastline, in fact, the whole of that West African region from Ghana through Benin and Togo and even into Nigeria has been really badly impacted, not so much by the climate change impacts, but by anthropogenic activity. What we are doing to the coastline makes the coastline so much more vulnerable to what will be climate change induced higher seas, more frequent storm surges in the future. I mean, that's just one example, but there are so many examples around the coastline of the way in which human intervention has made the African coastline so much more vulnerable.
Would you say, yes, I was just going to jump in a little bit. Do you think that the fact that the impacts of climate change, for example, are now so glaring almost to anyone who cares to see, that has kind of made it easier for researchers such as yourself to communicate the import of the work that you do?
Yeah, but do you know, it's not me really who should be communicating this. I mean, I think what fundamentally lies behind this research that we've been doing is that we want to give African heritage specialists across the whole of the continent a tool, because so many are, you know, don't have a voice. So even environmental impact assessments, let alone heritage impact assessments, environmental impact assessments are not undertaken routinely in most African countries. And that's even the wealthier ones, you know, and I could point to Kenya actually, or to South Africa, and to many of the West African countries. You know, these environmental impact assessments are absolutely critical for safeguarding not just heritage, but just the places we live in. And they need to be undertaken. And the way in which our environmental experts and our heritage experts are going to be able to do this is by having something in their hand that they can go to their governments and say, look at what's happening. This is the data. This is not something we've made up. This is not photos that we've been taking along the coastline that someone in government can say, well, you know, that's this year, and you know it happens every year, and so it's just a pattern. We're hopefully what we're doing is giving people, you know, something to wave in front of governments and say, right, from now on, do your environmental impact assessment, so we know what the interventions that we are talking about, whether that's building a port in Dakhla in Western Sahara, which is right on their Ramsar site, and who knows what's going to happen once that port is built, because of course it's sand mining again. They have to dredge to build the port, and this impacts the whole of that landscape. And what it does is it just makes more vulnerable the coastline of the African continent. And I can't remember what the figure is, but the percentage of people that live at the coast in Africa is huge compared to many other regions of the world. Most of the African population live at the coast.
And as I just come down to winding up here, do you think that sort of compelling data would be a motivation for governments around this side of the world to invest more in research? Because that has come up a lot in our discussions here. And does it strike you how woefully low the allocations on research tend to be in this part of the world?
Yes, so we wrote a paper, myself and colleagues wrote another paper in that same volume of Nature which is it's a bad title, but we couldn't really frame the title any other way. But it really speaks to the issues here. We called it Decolonizing Climate Change Heritage Research. And the point here is that it's not the responsibility of Africa and African peoples. It's the responsibility of the entire globe. And what we need is giving epistemic freedom to experts in Africa to be able to publish their research in papers like in journals like Nature, explaining what is important on the African continent, not what policymakers on a global scale think is important. So all of us who have the ability to provide tools, and when I say the word tools, I mean provide the data that enables heritage practitioners and environmental specialists in Africa to lobby both African institutions, but also global institutions. That's really important. I think that's hugely important for forwarding the action on climate change.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much. And we are actually coming to a close here, ladies and gentlemen. And so we are going to have our closing thoughts. And Otula, you have been waiting in the wings, as it were. And I think that there's something that you wanted to say, but you can wrap that up, together with your closing comments.
Yes. I think in the field of journalism, as I told you, it is evolving. The trend is nowadays towards what we call solutions journalism. Stories that tend to not just doomsday stories, but this can be solved like this. It was solved by so-and-so, or our neighbors are doing it like this, we can copy. That's the trend nowadays. We don't just do stories and go away. You tend to get what is your reader going to gain from it. So we emphasize solutions journalism, and it is picking up. In some places, they call it constructive journalism. But it's no longer just a question of throwing words. Above all, I would say that policymakers worldwide tend to listen to the media. I have seen researchers do research, hide it there. The minister did not read it. We gave it to the minister. But the day the media says research has been done to prove that mosquitoes can be eliminated by doing 1, 2, 3, it has not been used. The minister will go and pick it up and start working. I'll stop there since you have time.
All right, Karimos.
Okay. Yes. So I would want to go back to the theme of this event, which is climate change, exploring Africa, response and solutions. So I want us to come back to Africa. How do we do it? How did our fathers do it? They instilled morals into us using folklores and stories. The media is very important. And then we can spend ages doing research. But if those researches are not interpreted for the common man on the street, the man that did not even attend the secondary school, the woman on the market, if we do not interpret it in the language that they can understand, we are not going anywhere. It is easy to talk, but when you don't speak the language of a man, you're just speaking over their head. So yes, let's do it the African way, and then let's target our audience. Let's speak the language of our audience. Post-COP 27, what do we have to do? And I'm here too. I want to, tell everyone. I want us to know that it is in our hands. Let's take it everywhere we go to, in our homes. Let's have those little conversations in our religious centers, our friends, and the beer parlor. Let's have those little conversations to mobilize actions for climate change. It's not just the work of the government or the media. We are also the media. So let's mobilize. Let's join the train. Let's mobilize. Let's motivate. And let's manage the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. If you could get some of your closing thoughts, if you give it brief, that would be great.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think just to say thank you very much for having me. And what I hope I have been able to do is be a voice for the excellent, absolutely excellent heritage practitioners that you have here in Kenya and in all other, African countries that I've mentioned, who are doing such a job to protect the heritage of African countries, and they feel frustrated because they're not heard. It's the same, it's the same here in the UK. But the thing is that we're not heard, and I think what needs to happen is that if we can embed heritage in our way of thinking about our ways of life, then maybe we'll be heard a little bit more.
All right, thank you. Dr. Kaumbo, I'm giving you the last word here.
Thank you. First, I just want to repeat a statistic from World Wildlife Fund. We've already lost 60% of the wild animals across this planet. So we are really in the ICU when it comes to wildlife. And the wildlife crisis and the climate crisis are married. They are intertwined. Our wildlife stories have never been told by our own people. Africa has been the source for decades for award-winning films and stories that have been told around the world and driven and energized the environmental movement all around the world, but not here in Africa. So my parting shot is that we need, as Africans, to demand that we get all our films back and we educate our people with those films that were made about our own animals, but we also take advantage of the incredible talent that we have. There is no shortage of film industry in this continent. There's no shortage of creatives. There's no shortage of stories, as we've just heard. There's a phenomenal opportunity for Africa to take ownership of our own stories, to produce the equivalent of what Black Panther has done for the Black Lives Matter or the Woman King. We as Africans need to actually take ownership of our wildlife stories. Joe, today, Wildlife Direct remains the only company that produces wildlife documentaries in Africa by Africans for Africa. This is kind of shocking. I think that what it speaks to is an enormous opportunity out there, whether it's content for children or grown-ups, whether it's science or if it's fiction. We have a crisis on our hands, and we have a tool called storytelling and filmmaking that we can take advantage of. So I really hope that we can inspire people through this amazing festival, and thank you for the Nation Media Group for putting this on, because I do think that we can transform the future of climate and nature in the continent by doing this. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you very much to my panel, Dr. Clark, from whom we got a whole new set of lenses to look at heritage. Otula Owuor, the father of science journalism in this part of the world. Solutions journalism, that's my takeaway from him. Karimot Odebode, giving us the story of the small story. That is not the big story out there, but the small story. It could be just one person, but it is a story all the same, and it starts right there. And of course, Dr. Paula Kahumbu giving us the story of the Africanization of the wildlife story and putting people back into those wildlife stories. Thank you very much. My name is Joe Ageo. I wonder what Larry Asego would say about this. I know you started with being my friend. I don't know if we are still friends anymore.
No, we still are friends, and I think that's interesting narrative, because when we talk about telling our own stories, I mean, we're here looking at the context of Africa. What is Africa doing? It's time maybe we stop looking so much on the outside and start focusing on the inside, because that is where our strength is. We've been told that we are the youngest continent, and we need to harness that. And just get people to wake up to the reality that nobody's coming to save us. We have to do it ourselves. I think there's a travesty that people got the wake-up call when they saw wildlife dead in the parks, for them to realize that something is wrong. But it shouldn't have gotten to that stage.